The morning of September 13th, 1982, starts at Rockagel, the Grimaldi family's country estate perched in the hills near La Turbie, Monaco itself visible below like a cluster of model buildings beside an impossible blue sea. Princess Grace comes to breakfast and mentions that the back of her neck hurts. She and her youngest daughter Stéphanie have a short drive planned, down the mountain on the Route de la Turbie, through the serpentine hairpins of the D37 road to the palace. From there, Stéphanie has a train to catch to Paris, where school is about to begin. Stéphanie is 17 years old. She is sitting in the passenger seat of a Rover 3500. She does not have a driver's license. They don't reach Paris. They barely reach the second hairpin curve. The D37 is a road that earns your attention. It descends from the hilltop village of La Turbie in a series of tight, leftward curves, each one opening onto a view that takes up your peripheral vision, while the road itself demands the center. Grace had driven this route dozens of times. She knew where the rocks were. She knew the angles. She was an experienced driver on a familiar road in clear September morning light. And somewhere around 9:30 in the morning, that knowledge became irrelevant. A mild cerebral hemorrhage begins while her hands are still on the wheel, not after the car leaves the road, but before it. The stroke begins as she is actively navigating the descent. What witnesses below would later describe to the gendarmerie makes terrible, specific sense when you know this. The Rover begins to zigzag across the lane, strikes rocks on the left side of the road, briefly recovers speed, then accelerates toward the edge without any of the braking a driver in control would apply. A truck driver watching from a lower stretch of road saw the car doing exactly this. Many zigzags, rocks struck, then a straight, unbraked run to the void. Inside the car, Stéphanie sees her mother's face change. Grace mentions a severe headache. Then she goes somewhere Stéphanie can't reach, some interior space where the wheel in her hands and the road in front of her no longer register. The car begins moving wrong. Stéphanie reaches for the gear shift. She knew where park was, she explained years later, because she was about to take her driving test and the gear positions were fresh in her mind. She found it. She tried. The car was already past the point where any gear change could arrest 40 meters of mountainside. The Rover went over the edge. The fall was 40 meters, roughly 120 feet, and the car tumbled down the slope and came to rest with its right side embedded in the earth. Stéphanie was pulled from the wreckage through the driver's side door. The passenger door, her door, the door she would have used in any other set of circumstances, was crushed completely against the ground. The right flank of the Rover was half buried on impact. The left door was the only way out. She came through the driver's side because there was no other way, and the world would spend the next 20 years misreading that door. Her injuries: 3 cervical fractures, broken ribs, a hairline fracture of her spine, a mild concussion. She was alive. She was conscious enough to know, at the scene, what she had just witnessed and what it probably meant. One account records her crying out immediately after the crash that her mother was dead. She had been there. She had watched it happen from close enough to touch the dashboard. Whatever the clinical sequence of cerebral hemorrhage and impact and blood pressure and brain function, she already knew. Grace was lifted by helicopter to the Hôpital Princesse Grace in Monaco. The initial hemorrhage had been a cerebral vascular incident, relatively contained in its first expression, but at the hospital, a second, more severe hemorrhage followed, this one traumatic in origin from the crash impact. Damage to her brain, her thorax, and her femur. She was placed in a light coma and then on life support. On the evening of September 14, 1982, at 10:55 p.m., Prince Rainier authorized its removal. Grace Kelly died at 52 years old. 26 years after marrying into the principality she had told People magazine, just 5 months earlier, was no fairy tale. Stephanie wasn't in the room when this happened. She was in a different room in the same hospital, with 3 broken vertebrae and a concussion, and no one told her. Not that night, not the next day. For 2 full days after the crash, while Grace lay dying and then dead, while Prince Rainier stood at his wife's bedside and authorized the end of life support, while the palace was already beginning to manage the announcement that would go out to the world, for those 2 days, the 17-year-old in the other room was left to piece together what was happening from the silence itself. She had cried out at the scene that her mother was dead. She knew. And the official protocol of the palace, or the doctors, or both, made the decision that she shouldn't be told officially for 48 hours. She had apparently been right about what she'd seen. Nobody told her she was right. The funeral was held on September 18th, 5 days after the crash, at the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate in Monaco, with heads of state and dignitaries and Princess Diana, who was there less than a year after her own wedding. Stephanie was still in the hospital, still recovering from her fractures, and didn't attend. She missed the ceremony entirely. She missed the formal moment of goodbye, the gathered community of mourning, the ritual that is designed specifically to give the living something to do with their grief. She had none of that. She had a hospital room and a silence that lasted 48 hours, and the knowledge, confirmed to her in private, not in a church, that the person who had been sitting next to her when the morning went wrong was gone. Everything that came after has to be understood against that room. The palace's first public statement blamed brake failure. The rover's brakes, according to the initial communiqué, had reportedly failed on a sharp turn, a mechanical explanation that removed human agency from the equation entirely and, not incidentally, also removed the need to explain in detail why the car moved the way witnesses had described it moving. Hospital Chief Surgeon Dr. Jean Chatelain wasn't diplomatic about this characterization. He told the New York Times directly that the palace's initial communiques were garbage. The gendarmerie investigation, led by a captain named Roger Benza, who gave interviews about his findings years afterward, reached a definitive conclusion. "It's clear," Benza said, "that the driver of the vehicle has been Princess Grace from start to finish." The medical sequence was unambiguous. Cerebral vascular incident, occurring while Grace was driving, caused loss of consciousness and loss of control. The car then left the road. A second, more severe hemorrhage occurred at the hospital, almost certainly traumatic in origin from the crash impact. The death certificate read, "Cerebral and vascular hemorrhaging." 2 doctors informed the New York Times on September 17th, 3 days after Grace's death, that the princess had experienced a cerebral vascular incident that caused her to lose control. The factual answer was in print within 72 hours. On September 16, 1982, 2 days before Grace was buried, a French news agency raised a different question in mainstream print, and the New York Times picked it up the same day in a piece headlined, "A Grieving Monaco is Asking Questions." Grace was 52, it noted. Stephanie had been in the car. Stephanie was underage. Stephanie didn't hold a French driver's license at 17. What if the girl had been at the wheel? The architecture of that rumor is worth understanding precisely, because it wasn't constructed from pure malice. It was assembled from genuine ambiguity, fed by the palace's own evasions, and sustained by silence from the people best placed to correct it. A local gardener named Sesto Lipio told investigators he had seen the girl in the front and the woman in the back. 2 other eyewitnesses directly contradicted him. They had seen Grace driving. Lipio's account was the one that generated a story because it was the one that required a villain. The crushed door provided the rumor's second engine. Stephanie had been found exiting the driver's side, and anyone who didn't know the passenger door was embedded in the mountainside would read her position as evidence of something. A French forensic source later compressed the explanation into a single sentence. The right side of the rover was half crushed on the ground, and Stéphanie could only have exited from the driver's side. That single physical fact, clear and mechanical and innocent, took 2 decades to enter the public record in any meaningful way. Meanwhile, Grace Kelly's death had crystallized her image within hours of the news breaking. Since her wedding to Rainier in April of 1956, she had been among the most recognizable women on Earth, an Oscar-winning actress who had become a real princess, whose public persona had been constructed and maintained for 26 years as a form of perfection. Death locked that image permanently. She became a saint in the international press by the time the September 15th newspapers ran. Regal, immaculate, eternally composed. The portrait on the mantelpiece that never ages or argues or asks for anything difficult. Saints require contrast. Within days, the tabloid press had already begun positioning Stéphanie as the disruptive foil to that image. The wild one, the difficult daughter, the girl who couldn't inhabit her mother's standard. This framing preceded any actual evidence of wildness. It began structurally, with a gardener's disputed testimony and a crushed car door. Stéphanie Marie Elizabeth Grimaldi was born on February 1, 1965, the youngest of 3 children, 7 years after Albert and 8 years after Caroline. In the formal architecture of the Grimaldi dynasty, the youngest child carries the least institutional weight, at least initially. No hereditary obligation pressing down. Room to develop an identity before the obligations arrive. She was 17 in September of 1982, sitting in a passenger seat on the way to Paris to start school. A genuine, ordinary teenage beginning of an independent life. The crash interrupted it mid-motion. Grace Kelly had spent 26 years managing Monaco's most demanding performance requirement. She had been an actress of real skill, had won the Oscar for The Country Girl in 1955, had brought genuine craft to every role before Rainier and the Principality offered her a different, and arguably less forgiving stage. Princess Grace had no critics in the theatrical sense. Nobody wrote a bad review of her curtsy. What she had instead were 26 years of being an emblem for a small principality whose identity was inseparable from her image, and the requirement that her private self remain permanently subordinate to that function. She told People in June of 1982, 5 months before she would die on that road, that her life was no fairy tale. The observation went largely unreported at the time. After her death, the fairy tale was the only story that got told. Both women were handed the same arrangement: be Monaco's emblem, perform serenity regardless of what is actually happening behind it, sublimate the private self to the principality's image needs. Grace managed it with extraordinary discipline for over 2 decades. Stéphanie arrived at the same obligation at 17, in a hospital bed, with broken bones and a driving accusation already forming in the press outside her window. What she didn't have, and never had, was 26 years of practiced composure to manage it with. She had been a teenager on her way to school. She arrived at the public stage through the wreckage of a rover at the bottom of a mountainside, and the public had already decided who she was before she got there. For 7 years after the crash, she said nothing publicly about the accusation that she had been driving. She was 17, then 18, then 19, then 20. Building a life while carrying a public verdict she had been given no mechanism to formally contest. The palace had not offered her one. Her family had issued no statement. The gendarmerie report confirming Grace's driving was official, and it was essentially invisible to the tabloid press that had already planted a different seed. What Stéphanie did during those 7 years was work. She moved to Paris, studied fashion design, pursued modeling, operated in the industry with the focus and visual intelligence of someone who had grown up inside one of the world's most aesthetically self-conscious principalities. She was learning how to make things. Then, in the spring of 1986, she made something undeniable. A 7-inch single on Julissa, a subsidiary of Carrère Records, arrived in French record shops. The producer was Yves Rose. The songwriter was Romano Musamara. Stéphanie had produced the original version herself before signing the label deal, which is a fact worth pausing on. She didn't arrive at a studio with a record company's blueprint and a stylist's instructions. She arrived with a finished demo of her own making, at 21 years old, and the label heard something worth releasing. The song was called Ouragan. On April 5, 1986, it debuted on the French singles chart at number 17. 3 weeks later, on April 26th, it was at number 1. It stayed there for 10 consecutive weeks, the first single in the history of the French singles chart to hold the top position for that long. By the end of the year, it was the second best-selling single in France for 1986, with a platinum certification confirming at least 1 million copies sold in France alone. The English-language version, Irresistible, debuted in Germany and jumped from 64 to 8 on trade charts in a single reporting cycle. In West Germany, Ouragan peaked at number 2 and spent 18 weeks on the chart. In Switzerland, it reached number 11. The album, Besoin, followed in September of 1986 and reached number 6 on the French albums chart. A second single, Flash, came out before the year ended and went top 5 across several European countries. To put this in concrete terms, she walked into a chart system in one of the most competitive pop markets in Europe in the mid-1980s, hit number 1 in 10 weeks, and held it for more than 2 months. She was 21 years old, and she had just made one of the most successful pop singles in European chart history. What she got for it, in much of the press, was a raised eyebrow. The comparison to Grace Kelly was deployed constantly, and always in the same direction. Not to acknowledge that a woman of unusual talent had produced something extraordinary, but to note that an Oscar winner's daughter was making pop music, with the implication that the distance between the two careers was self-evident. The dismissal was structural. The two careers aren't in competition unless you decide in advance that they should be, and the press had decided. Stéphanie's single spent 10 weeks at the top of the French charts. The week it debuted at number 1, there were also newspaper stories raising questions about her suitability as a princess. Both things were happening simultaneously, in the same publications, and only one of them was framed as the real story. By the fall of 1989, 7 years had passed. Stéphanie was 24. The driving rumor had been circulating for the entirety of her public adult life. She sat down with an author named Jeffrey Robinson, who had been granted access to the Grimaldi family and was writing about Grace. She spoke to him about the crash for the first time on record. The Chicago Tribune published an account of the conversation on October 23, 1989, under the headline, Princess Grace's Fatal Crash, Her Daughter's Account. What she said to Robinson wasn't complex. It was simple and devastating. There was a lot of pressure on me because everyone was saying that I had been driving the car, that it was all my fault, that I'd killed my mother. It's not easy when you're 17 to live with that. In French, in the same conversation, she put it in 6 words. On disait que j'avais tué ma mère. They said I killed my mother. The 1989 denial didn't stop the rumor. Robinson's book reached its readers, but the mechanics of how a false story sustains itself don't require the truth to be unavailable. They only require the correction to be narrower than the original lie's distribution. The accusation had been seeded in mass circulation newspapers, in television entertainment programs, in casual conversation across Europe and North America for 7 years. The correction landed in a book. The book's readers believed her. The tabloids didn't revise. Her family had not publicly defended her. Not Rainier, not Albert, not Caroline. No documented public statement from any Grimaldi family member directly refuting the driving accusation exists in the historical record from those 2 decades. The palace that had blamed brake failure on the day of the crash apparently found no occasion, over 20 years, to state what the gendarmerie investigation had confirmed. Grace was driving from start to finish, and the girl in the passenger seat tried to stop a car she wasn't licensed to drive. The weight of that silence isn't straightforward to assess. Rainier was a man who had just lost his wife of 26 years under catastrophic circumstances, was ruling a principality, and was managing 3 grieving children, while also being a public figure in a world that had made his private grief into a global event. He wasn't a man without his own wounds, but the effect of his silence, whatever its cause, was that Stéphanie spent 7 years carrying a false accusation of killing her own mother without the institutional standing to correct it, and then another 13 years after her first denial, watching the accusation continue to circulate. Stéphanie's own words on what this cost her wouldn't come in full until 2002. In the years between, she was building her life in the only way available to her, in motion, in choices that prioritized something real over something managed, in relationships with people who had no stake in Monaco's image requirements and no reason to view her through the lens of her mother's ghost. By 1992, Stéphanie was 27. She had been a pop star with real chart numbers, a fashion professional, a tabloid fixture for a decade, and a person who had never, in any public forum, received a formal institutional acknowledgement that the thing being said about her was false. Into this environment came Daniel Ducrouet. He was working on her palace security detail, not titled, not wealthy, the exact opposite of a dynastic match. By multiple accounts, he was straightforwardly devoted to her, in the uncomplicated way of a person whose relationship to her had nothing to do with what she represented. On November 26, 1992, their son Louis-René Maxime Ducrouet was born at the Princess Grace Hospital Center in Monaco. On May 4, 1994, their daughter Pauline Grace Magui Ducrouet was born at the same hospital. Both children arrived before any marriage, in a principality whose dynastic history made unwed births by a princess a matter of institutional significance. Prince Rainier was strongly opposed to the relationship. Multiple accounts describe him as appearing immovable on the question of a wedding, inflexible, reluctant, unconvinced. Stéphanie pushed for at least 2 years after Pauline's birth, campaigning persistently for her father's approval. Rainier relented only after his own double bypass surgery, a physical confrontation with mortality that apparently clarified some calculus. The civil ceremony was held on July 1, 1995, at the Palace of Monaco, a protocol-breaking event by any dynastic standard, a wedding that required years of campaigning just to be permitted. 14 months later, the marriage was over. In August of 1996, photographs were taken at a remote Monaco villa. Danielle Ducrouet, naked, with a Belgian model named Muriel Mol-Houtman, identified in the European press as Miss Bare Breasts of Belgium, 1995. 40 pages of images ran in the Italian magazines Eva Tremila and Gente, starting August 28th, and spread through European newspapers within days. The New York Times covered the story on September 17th, characterizing the images as showing Ducrouet cavorting naked with Hoteman. Stéphanie would have seen those covers. In a world before smartphones, the magazines and newspapers would have been brought to her, or she would have seen them at a newsstand, or someone would have told her and then brought them anyway. She had campaigned for years for the right to marry this man, against a father who had opposed it, against a court that thought the whole thing beneath the principality's dignity. And then, 40 pages in an Italian magazine arrived to confirm, at least in terms of visible evidence, that everyone who had doubted the marriage was right to doubt it. She submitted a written divorce request on September 16th. The divorce was finalized on October 4th, 18 days from filing to finalization, a speed that suggests she had already decided everything she needed to decide before the paperwork started. The photographs had an architect, a Brussels-based photographer named Stéphanie de Lisecki, described in subsequent reporting as an acquaintance of Moll Houdeman's, and the apparent organizer of the situation at the villa, was later given a 1-year suspended sentence in connection with the photographs. A court found sufficient grounds to hand a criminal penalty to the man identified as having engineered what took place. That is the established legal fact. Ducrouet's own later claim, made to Italian broadcaster RAI, that he had been drugged and set up, remains his own account rather than a finding. But the photographer's criminal penalty sits in the record regardless of what Ducrouet was or wasn't told. Someone arranged for those pictures to exist. Someone sold them to the right publications at the right moment. A court named one of those someones and sentenced him. For Stéphanie, it was the second time in 14 years that a public humiliation had arrived through channels she hadn't invited and couldn't have anticipated. The first time, a car door did the work. This time, 40 pages of Italian magazine. The architecture differed. The experience, her private life destroyed in public while the world watched and drew conclusions about her character, was familiar. She made no public statement about the Ducrouet scandal. She filed for divorce. She was 31 years old with 2 young children and a 3rd pregnancy ahead of her, alone again, in a palace that had questioned the marriage from the beginning. 2 years later, on July 15, 1998, Camille Marie Kelly Gottlieb was born, the middle name honoring Grace. The father was Jean-Raymond Gottlieb, another palace security guard, another man who existed entirely outside the dynastic structure. Another relationship the tabloids filed under the same heading, evidence of chaos, of dysfunction, of a princess who couldn't conduct herself with appropriate dignity. The pattern looks different if you approach it from the direction of evidence rather than judgment. Beginning in 1982, the institutional structure of the palace had blamed brake failure, allowed a false accusation to circulate, offered no public defense, blocked a marriage for years, and ultimately permitted the principality's press apparatus to watch Stéphanie's private life get photographed and sold. The men she consistently chose had nothing to do with any of that structure. They didn't come from it, they weren't protected by it, they weren't performing on its behalf. Whatever safety felt like to Stéphanie Grimaldi by the late 1990s, it clearly wasn't inside the institution that had never protected her. The men weren't the palace. In a life that had given her plenty of specific reasons to distrust the palace, that may have been the most essential thing about them. In October of 2002, Stéphanie gave Paris Match the interview it and the world had been waiting for, whether they had been willing to name that wait or not. The Guardian covered the interview on October 11th under the headline, "Stéphanie, I wasn't at wheel when Grace was killed." The Independent described it as her first time speaking publicly about the crash. BBC News covered it the same week with the headline, "Monaco Princess Denies Crash Rumors." Hello Magazine ran the fuller version of her remarks. The interview generated simultaneous international coverage in multiple languages and publications, because 20 years later, it was still news that she was saying this. The rumor had persisted long enough, widely enough, that her plain statement of a verified fact was considered a news event. The words themselves were quiet and precise. "I wasn't driving, that's clear," she said in Paris Match. "In fact, I was thrown around inside the car like my mother, who was catapulted onto the back seat. The passenger door was completely smashed in. I got out on the only accessible side, the driver's." Then the gear shift detail, the one that is so specific and so human, it lands differently from everything else. She'd reached for park because she was about to take her driving test and she knew the gear positions. A 17-year-old girl, reaching for a gear lever in a car going over a cliff, doing the only thing she could think to do with the knowledge she had. She was 17 years old and about to take her driving test. She knew where park was. She tried. She was 37 years old when she said all of this in public. The crash had happened when she was 17. She had been 20 years a passenger in someone else's narrative about the worst morning of her life. In Hello Magazine's coverage, she said, "Not only did I go through the horrible trauma of losing my mother at a very young age, but I was beside her at the moment of the accident. Nobody can imagine how much I've suffered and still suffer." And then, quieter, "Unless, perhaps, the fact that I am still here and that it was I who survived." Those last words are the ones the tabloids never ran as a headline. They describe something harder to commodify than scandal. They describe what it actually costs to be the person who was in the passenger seat, who tried to stop the car, who was pulled out through the driver's door, who spent 2 days in a hospital not being told, who missed the funeral, who was then told by the world that she had caused all of it, and who carried that particular form of torment for 20 years, while everyone else moved on to the next story. She also said, in the same interview, "I just want to say, stop. Let me raise my children in tranquility and go forward with my own life in serenity." She said this while she was, at that specific moment, living in a circus caravan in Switzerland. By 2001, Stéphanie Grimaldi was 36 years old. She had been a pop star with genuine chart numbers, then a fashion professional, then a mother of 2, then briefly a wife, then the subject of 40 Italian magazine pages, then a mother of 3 by 2 different men, then a tabloid fixture who had never, in 20 years, been given the institutional support that would have made any of those public fights easier to survive. Monaco had not sheltered her from any of it. Whatever she was looking for, stability, anonymity, something that felt genuinely chosen, it wasn't inside the principality. So she went to the circus. The International Circus Festival of Monte Carlo had been part of her world since childhood. Prince Rainier founded it in 1974, and for years, Stéphanie attended as a member of the royal family, the youngest Grimaldi at the ringside, growing up around trapeze artists and animal trainers and acrobats whose daily lives consisted of skills practiced to the edge of human capability and performed in front of strangers every night. At the 1999 festival, she presented the Best Animal Act Award to a Swiss elephant trainer named Franco Cani. By 2001, she had moved all 3 of her children, Louis, now 8, Pauline, now 7, Camille, 3, into Cani's circus caravan. Franco Cani was married to someone else at the time. The Telegraph ran the headline, "I'll never leave the circus," says Princess's lover. Hello Magazine sent a photographer and published images of Stéphanie and Cani with all 3 children at a children's park. An outdoor afternoon, children in motion, adults watching them from nearby. The images were remarkable for how unremarkable they were. Not chaos, not spectacle. A woman and a man and 3 children at a park on a regular afternoon, with the Swiss Alps visible somewhere behind it. The tabloid mythology required this chapter to be the final proof of total royal collapse, the evidence that she had definitively lost the thread. The photographic evidence that Hello Magazine chose to run was an afternoon in fresh air. The caravan itself was the real story, and not in the way the tabloids told it. A Monaco princess had moved her children out of a palace and into a traveling circus in Switzerland, had traded a fixed address for a schedule that followed the Cani circus across Europe, had placed herself and her 3 children inside a community defined by physical skill, mutual dependence, constant motion, and the requirement to perform something genuine in front of strangers every night. No dynasty, no image management apparatus, no institutional structure mediating between her and the people around her. The Telegraph reported that she spent at least 2 months touring Europe with the circus. Her children based themselves in Switzerland during that period, the Alps rather than the Mediterranean, the big tent rather than the palace. What Stéphanie herself made of those months isn't documented in any interview with the directness she brought to other subjects. What is documented is what she did next. She didn't leave the circus world. She stayed connected to it. The relationship with Kini ended. In September of 2003, she married a Portuguese acrobat named Adonis Lopes Perez, 10 years her junior, confirmed by the palace spokesman in a brief announcement. The ceremony was private. The marriage was brief. Neither party made a public statement when it ended. The circus chapter was never really a chapter. It was the beginning of the only institutional home Stéphanie built on her own terms. Prince Rainier had founded the International Circus Festival in 1974, and he had run it for 30 years with the enthusiasm of a man who found something genuinely joyful in the tent. When he died on April 6, 2005, and Albert II took the throne, the patronage of the festival passed to Stéphanie. The woman who had been photographed living in the circus caravan became the president of the circus festival, which isn't a come-down from the palace, but an arrival at something that had been hers all along, rooted in a world she had chosen before anyone handed it to her officially. She chaired the 48th edition of the Monte Carlo International Circus Festival in January of 2026, 45 years after her father built the institution. In 2004, a year before Rainier's death, Stéphanie built something of her own from scratch. Fight AIDS Monaco was founded that year, with her as its founding president. The mission was direct: raise awareness of HIV and AIDS, prevent new infections, challenge the stigma that surrounds both. 2 years after the foundation launched, in 2006, she was appointed UNAIDS International Goodwill Ambassador, the United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, which coordinates the global response to the epidemic at governmental and institutional levels. It's a working appointment. Goodwill ambassadors engage directly with affected communities, participate in policy advocacy, and represent the program's priorities in international settings. She has held it for nearly 20 years. The connection between her chosen cause and her own history isn't incidental, and it doesn't require much analysis to see. HIV and AIDS patients have been subjected, since the early years of the epidemic, to a specific and recognizable cluster of mechanisms: public condemnation, framed as moral judgment, institutional silence, a press that treated their suffering as evidence of personal failure, and a social apparatus that found it far easier to sustain a stigma than to dismantle one. The people carrying those stigmas were asked, in effect, to remain quiet about what they were experiencing, to accept the verdict of the majority's discomfort as the price of being allowed to exist in public life at all. Stéphanie had watched those same mechanisms operate on herself for 3 decades, beginning at 17 with a car door and a gardener's disputed testimony. She understood, not abstractly, but from the inside of a sustained experience, what it costs to be the person the world has designated as representing something shameful. She understood what institutional silence does to the person it's supposed to protect. She understood the particular exhaustion of carrying a false label across decades, while the record that should correct it stays locked in a book or a gendarmerie file or a hospital report that nobody in the mass media finds worth running. She didn't say any of this publicly in those precise terms. What she said, in December of 2025, when asked about her work and whether she was considering stepping back from it, was, "I use my public profile to advance the fight against AIDS and to challenge the stigma that surrounds it. And when the question turned to retirement, I never said I was retiring." In January of 2026, she chaired the Circus Festival opening. On February 1st, 2025, she turned 60. Asked by Monaco Tribune to reflect on her life, she said, "I've just taken life as it came." 6 words that contain the entirety of the story, if you know where she came from. The tabloid version of Stephanie Grimaldi's life is a story about squandered privilege. A princess who had every conceivable advantage and threw it away for bodyguards and circus performers, and choices that proved she was constitutionally unsuited for the dignity her birth required. It's a story with the satisfying shape of a moral lesson about ingratitude and instability, and it circulated for 4 decades across European and American tabloids with very little real examination of what it was actually built on. It requires you to start from the choices and work backward, deciding in advance that the choices were failures, and then arranging the evidence to confirm the verdict. Start instead from September 13th, 1982. Start from the passenger seat of a Rover 3500 on the Route de la Turbie. A gear shift Stephanie tried to put in park. A door crushed into the mountainside. Start from 48 hours in a hospital, not knowing her mother was dead. A funeral she couldn't attend because her spine was fractured in 3 places. And then a newspaper on September 16th, asking in print whether the girl might have been driving. Before the body was buried, before the investigation was concluded, before she had been formally told that the person she had been sitting next to was gone. Start from a palace that issued a communiqué about brake failure on the day of the crash and left no documented public defense of its youngest child in the face of a 20-year accusation that she had killed her mother. Start from all of that, and then look at the choices again. The music career wasn't a vanity. Ouragan held the top of the French singles chart for 10 consecutive weeks and was the second best-selling single in France for the entire year of 1986. Built on a demo she had produced herself, at 21, from inside a life that was already being written off in the press before it had properly begun. The relationships with men outside the palace hierarchy weren't dysfunction. They were a consistent, coherent preference across 2 decades for people whose connection to her was personal rather than institutional, for men who existed entirely outside the structure that had not defended her, that had blocked her marriage, that had been present at every humiliation and raised no public objection to any of them. Whatever those relationships cost her, she chose them freely and with her eyes open. That isn't chaos. That is a preference. The circus years weren't a breakdown. They were where she found the community that became her permanent home. The place she runs now, in January of 2026, from the same president's chair her father occupied. And Fight AIDS Monaco, the organization she has led since 2004, the UN AIDS ambassadorship she has held since 2006, the stigma she challenges every time she steps to a microphone and refuses to be quiet about people the world finds easier to ignore. That isn't the accidental rehabilitation of a woman who ran out of other options. It's the deliberate construction of something meaningful by a woman who knew from long personal experience exactly what stigma does to a person and decided to spend her later life fighting it in others. Grace Kelly told People magazine her life was no fairy tale 5 months before she died on that road. Stephanie found that out firsthand at 17 and never had the option of revising it back into something more comfortable. The crash was the beginning. 2 days in a hospital, not knowing. A rumor that ran for 20 years. A family that said nothing. A world that said too much. All of it wrong. She is 60 years old, the president of an AIDS charity, the patron of a circus festival, still refusing to retire, still here, and the story the tabloids spent 40 years telling about her was never the actual story. Subscribe for more stories like this one.